If video game genres were charted on a line, fighting games and RPGs might be further apart than any other two genres. Though they both focus on combat, their mechanical approach to adapting fighting into games are in opposition. Fighting games are all about reaction, split-second decision-making, and precise execution. Different fighting games vary in speed and complexity, but by and large, they're so demanding to play at a competent level that they need to structure themselves into short burst rounds to give the player regular breaks. They are pure skill-based games. Any roadblocks can only be overcome through education and training. RPGs, on the other hand, slow combat down and zoom it out. RPG combat is more concerned with strategy and planning than quick reflexes, and only the most hardcore action RPGs focus on execution. Skill in RPGs is less about mechanical proficiency and more about knowledge and resource management. The main difference between the two genres, though, is their contrasting modes of progression and motivation. Fighting games thrive on intrinsic motivation, the drive and satisfaction of self-improvement. You get as much out of a fighting game as you put into it. RPGs are the exact opposite, using extrinsic motivation more than any other type of game. Player growth is achieved by mechanical means like better gear, new abilities, and leveling up. Intrinsic and extrinsic motivators can certainly be used in conjunction, but melding skill-based progression with stat-based progression can be tricky. Lean too hard one way, and the stats can overcompensate for a lack of skill. Lean too hard the other way, and skill is the defining factor to such a degree that stats have negligible impact on the game. The gulf in speed, intensity, focus, and progression between fighting games and RPGs means that the two may never truly be able to mix. This impossible combination is what Dissidia Final Fantasy tries to accomplish. Released for the PSP, Dissidia is a crossover fighting game spin-off of the famous JRPG franchise. Between gacha game promotions and Fortnite, crossovers are commonplace now, but when Dissidia was released, it was the first time players got to see the heroes from the main Final Fantasy games in the same place. That prospect alone would be enough to warrant the game's existence. Square Enix could have made a bog-standard fighting game, or a game of any genre really, and it would have likely been successful. Dissidia strives for much, much more than that. It tries to create a whole new subgenre of fighting game, one that truly fits in the Final Fantasy canon. By transplanting Final Fantasy style and rhythms into an arena fighter, Square Enix came as close as anyone has to bridging that divide between two of gaming's most contrasting genres. Let's take a quick look at a standard Final Fantasy battle. The ATB system gives the game a sense of fluidity that rigid turn-based systems lack. It's also a system that's constantly building anticipation. You likely know what move comes next, you just need that meter to fill up. Lastly, the ATB system oddly forces battles to take a certain amount of time. You can't mash through menus to get things over with. Even the weakest enemies live as long as it takes for the ATB meter to fill. If Dissidia were made today, it would certainly have used MOBA-like ability cooldowns to replicate the ATB system. Instead, Dissidia takes a much more convoluted and interesting path to implementing Final Fantasy into a fighting game. The game is built entirely around the bravery system. Each player has a number above their health bars, called their bravery. When the player lands a damaging attack, they inflict damage equal to their own bravery to the enemy's health. After landing the attack, their bravery resets to 0. They can then either wait a few moments for their bravery to reset to a default amount, or attack the other player and steal their bravery. That's the core loop of Dissidia, each player trying to build up their bravery and land damaging hits until they win. Characters' attacks are split into two categories, bravery attacks and HP attacks. Bravery attacks are the most common, quick moves that require less commitment and may be able to combo into each other. These attacks target the enemy's bravery, stealing it and increasing the player's own bravery. HP attacks are much harder to hit, take longer to cast, and force the player to commit hard to them. These are the attacks that spend bravery to deal HP damage. Because of the difficulty in landing HP moves, it's generally a better idea to build your bravery for one big move rather than chip away an enemy's health with smaller attacks. Another reason this is usually the right call is the bravery break system. Over the course of a battle, a pool of bravery is built up. If one player is able to lower the other player's bravery below 0, they add that pool to their bravery. Breaking the opponent's bravery is by far the best way to raise your own. The struggle between players stealing each other's bravery, working their way towards the payout of a bravery break, is how Dissidia mimics the anticipation of the ATB meter. When a break does happen, the fact that an HP move is coming next is all but certain. One more quirk of the Bravery Break system allows it to translate a turn-based rhythm into Dissidia's combat. When Bravery is broken, the broken player can do no damage until their Bravery resets to default, and their Bravery recovers at a slowed rate. However, they can instantly reset their Bravery if they land an HP attack. Therefore, a Bravery Break shifts combat to a state where both players are trying to land their riskier moves. Riskier moves mean they're easier to dodge, and if they're dodged, the attacker is left wide open, letting the other player take their turn. You may think that this means the obvious choice is to play defense and bait an HP attack, and while that certainly is an approach, both sides are incentivized to press the attack. The player who gained the Bravery wants to cash in on their advantage, lest they wait too long and the other player gets to steal some of that Bravery back. The player whose Bravery is broken wants to reset their status, hoping not to let their opponent hold their advantage. All of this also means that, if between characters with equivalent stats, battles will have to take a certain amount of time, a likely unintentional replication of the likely unintentional minimum length of ATB battles. If a player decides they want the game to lean even more towards Final Fantasy, they have the option of using Command Mode, which removes much of the player's direct control over their character in favor of selecting actions from a classic JRPG menu. The whole Bravery system is really not an obvious way to get Dissidia to feel like Final Fantasy. One could even argue it was a bad idea to do it in such a roundabout way. Nonetheless, the end result is somehow right at home with the franchise, especially as it stood in the late 2000s. Final Fantasy had moved past simple and elegant systems like 5's Job System or 7's Materia, and was now knee-deep in 10's Sphere Grid, 12's License Board and Gambits, and 11's being an MMORPG. Final Fantasy was becoming synonymous with complex and abstract approaches to things that used to be simple. The thing is, when you do things in such an odd way, you can capture something genuinely new and difficult to replicate. No game has really built on what Dissidia's battle system lays out. The realm of arena fighters is dominated by licensed anime games like the Naruto Ninja Storm titles and casual party games like Gang Beasts. The only other fighting game I can think of that requires attacks to build a different move that actually deals damage is PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale, and the decision to use that mechanic is its most common criticism. Even Dissidia's own sequel, Dissidia NT, pulls back on much of its defining traits to become a class-based team brawler in an odd bid for esports. Esports is a bizarre direction for the series, because even though it's a unique and fun fighting game, it has some glaring issues as a competitive game. For a game to have a thriving competitive scene, it needs to have depth in its mechanics for pros to grow and prove their skill over the average player. Dissidia simply isn't deep enough to provide this. With few exceptions, a character can only take up to 12 moves into battle at a time, and that 12 is broken further down into chunks of 3, depending on if they're HP or Bravery moves, and if they're used in the ground or on the air. If you fight primarily in the air, you really only have 3 moves for the majority of a battle. A player doesn't have enough options at any given moment to express themselves mechanically, and that turn-based rhythm can make Dissidia's depth feel closer to Pong than Street Fighter. The real nail in Dissidia's competitive coffin is one of the fighting game genre's cardinal sins: overtuned defensive options. The large arenas make playing keep away all too easy, something made worse by a generous dodge ability. It's almost trivial to dodge any attack. The only thing really stopping you from dancing around the stage is the fact that you might want to deal some damage too. As if the dodge didn't already encourage overly defensive play, there's also an incredibly powerful block. It's more of a parry, really, and blocking the majority of Bravery moves will leave your opponent comically staggered, opening them up for any retaliation you could want. A successful guard even guarantees a crit if you counter with a Bravery move, making it an even more stacked defensive option. In fairness, a mistimed block can leave you just as wide open, and allows the opponent to get a crit on you. Even so, in combination with the dodge, it makes it much more advantageous to wait for your opponent to make the first move than to go on the offensive. It seems that Dissidia may be aware of its shortcomings as a competitive game, because it definitely does not put its eggs in that basket. My favorite thing about Dissidia is that it's perhaps the only fighting game whose primary concern is single-player content. The Bravery system may be an obtuse translation of Final Fantasy to this genre, but everything else is overt. Instead of spending time labbing combos or grinding out online matches, Dissidia is all about grinding in the classic RPG sense. Each character can go from level 1 to level 99, increasing their stats and unlocking new moves along the way. Fighters tend to start with only one move in each category, easing players into their unique playstyle. By the time you get a grip on a character's game plan, you start to unlock more moves that you can slot in, expanding their options and opening other playstyles. For example, Vaughn starts out with a couple quick melee moves, pushing him into a rushdown playstyle. A couple levels later though, he unlocks a crossbow ability that gives him a strong ranged option, and after a few more levels, he gets a defensive sword and shield ability. Suddenly, this character who excelled in chasing down enemies can become one that fights at a distance, knocking enemies away if they get too close. The game might not allow for much player expression in the middle of battle, but that's because the player expresses himself in the decisions they make before the battles begin. Those choices aren't limited to moves either. There's also a full equipment system. Slots for head and body armor, a shield, and a weapon can increase stats like damage, health, defense, and bravery. Accessory slots can offer a wide range of effects, like increased experience for a certain range of levels or a stat boost after breaking the opponent's bravery. The Final Fantasy staple of summons are carried over as well. One can be equipped at a time, and while they aren't giant damage moves this time around, they can still make or break a match. Ifrit can multiply your bravery after a break, turning an advantage into a one-hit kill. Magic Pot can copy your opponent's bravery, leveling the playing field no matter how far behind you are. Any depth the combat may be lacking is made up for in the RPG systems that are played with between bouts. Between changing characters, changing how those characters play, giving them different accessories and summons to try different strats, or even the simple joy of grinding one character up to level 99, Dissidia is always able to stay fresh and push the player to work towards something new. Character progression isn't the only goal the game offers though. There's also a store to unlock more stages, characters, and costumes. There's also a ton of other bonuses like music and one-off experience boosts. You get currency every battle, so purchases here are usually more an added bonus than something to work for. The last unlock system takes a lot more concentrated effort. Battle Gen is essentially Dissidia's take on crafting or synthesis. Each character in the game has a series of components that can only drop from defeating them, but simply winning isn't enough. Certain requirements must be met, depending on which component you are trying to get. These components can be combined to make the game's most powerful equipment and accessories. If you're the kind of player who doesn't mind doing what it takes for the best gear, Dissidia has more than enough for you to chip away at. The other ways Dissidia sprinkles Final Fantasy throughout the game are a joy to discover. The movesets of each character reflect their roles in their own games, like Terra being a mage for instance, but they're also often given unique mechanics to feel like the essence of their own games are being preserved. Lightning comes equipped with the Paradigm system, being able to swap between 3 different movesets on the fly that correspond to paradigms from her game. Cecil swaps between a Dark Knight and a Paladin in the middle of a fight, carrying over both halves of him from Final Fantasy IV. Bartz's whole moveset is borrowed from other fighters, an archetype present in many fighting games, but justified with the Mimic ability he can use in Final Fantasy V. The game has tutorials for every little thing, which wouldn't be notable if not for the fact that each of them are given by characters from throughout the series. It's very minimal, but other party members and NPCs getting some representation is a nice touch. Some of them even have fun dialogue with each other, like Ultros and Realm from Final Fantasy VI arguing over who is the best at explaining accessories to the player. Of course, Moogles and Chocobo have a presence in the game as well. Being a game on a portable device, Dissidia has a few systems that highlight that aspect. Moogles will send you mail with cute messages and a few rewards every day, urging the player to check in daily and claim their items. Chocobos feature in the Play Plan system. A Chocobo runs on a Tamagotchi-like window, picking up experience boosters and items as players finish battles. Players can choose whether they're casual, average, or hardcore gamers, this choice deciding how long it will take for the Chocobo to earn a reward. Shorter paths grant lesser rewards more often, vice versa for longer paths. Players can also choose a favored day of the week, the day they expect they'll play the most, and earn bonus experience and gold on that day. I know that mobile phone gaming has been around in Japan longer than the West, but Dissidia predates smartphone gaming by several years. These systems felt like a novel idea back then, but now they feel like precursors to the ways modern mobile games hook players to play daily for months on end. Dissidia's use of RPG mechanics gives it nearly endless playability. stretching a somewhat simplistic fighting game into hours upon hours of satisfying single-player content. Really though, the draw of any good RPG is its story, and Dissidia wouldn't pass on the biggest genre staple of all. The story mode is a full 20 to 30 hour experience chock full of overblown JRPG goodness. It's got good versus evil deities, fate, time loops, and memory loss all played as seriously as they would be in a mainline title. Warriors from across all of Final Fantasy are plucked from their worlds and brought to a new land to fight an eternal war of good and evil. The heroes are brought to serve under Cosmos, the goddess of good and order and nice things, while the villains are bound to Chaos, the god of being evil and bad and breaking stuff for fun. At the story's start, the war has already been raging for countless years. The world is trapped in a cycle. When one side wins the war, the slate is swept clean. The losing side has the memories of the cycle wiped, while the winners get to keep them as an advantage for the next go-round. The story mode concerns the ending of that cycle, how the heroes may win after 12 loops of losing to Chaos. Like all the best fighting games, Dissidia got an improved re-release with new content a couple years later called Dissidia 012 Duodecim. Its most notable addition is a new chapter of story mode that takes place during the 12th cycle, featuring a cast of new characters who didn't appear in the original release. If this story takes place before the original, then why didn't these people appear in the 13th cycle? This prologue chapter is all about answering that question. It's self-justifying in a funny way. The existence of the story presents an issue that the story itself is about resolving. It's nearly half the length of the base story, and in Duodecim, it must be completed to play the base story. Really, it's kind of a waste of time, or it would be if it wasn't a more emotional story than the main one. The warriors of Cosmos are near the end of their rope until Cosmos herself offers a way forward. Each fighter must find a crystal unique to them, one that will give them the power to defeat Chaos. It's a small bit of hope, but finding the crystals seems impossible in the current state of the war. An endless swarm of mindless soldiers called mannequins only seem to multiply as the heroes fight them. The player works their way through chapters featuring each of Duodecim's new characters as they struggle to find a way forward. There isn't much of a hint as to how to find the crystals or what form they might take, so there's no choice but to keep battling. Even with the promise of the crystals, it's hard for the warriors to be optimistic. For this reason, Final Fantasy IV's Kain and the original Warrior of Light decide to betray their allies, cutting them down on their own. They know that the war works in cycles, and have given up hope on the current one. They intend to force a reset by limiting their own forces in the hope that next time they'll have a chance. The others fail to find their crystals, although alongside some diversions recreating elements of the stories from their individual games, they learn the truth of the mannequins. Chaos can give the mannequins orders, but he doesn't create them. They're from another realm, pouring in from a dimensional rift in reality. The cast learns where this rift is located, and that they may be able to close it and stop any more mannequins from coming in the next cycle. Doing so would require facing the horde head-on, and that leaves little hope of success. They choose to take the chance anyway. Kain is swayed from his original plan, placing the warriors he'd already defeated in a safe location to reawaken in the next cycle. The Duodecim characters battle through the horde and manage to close the rift, but the mannequins that made it through are too numerous and the heroes are defeated. Through some precise world building to make this defeat different from the other 12 cycles where the heroes all lost, the mannequins possess a brutality that means losing to them is full erasure, not just stasis. The prologue ends with the original cast waiting for the reset, as the Duodecim cast vanishes completely, sacrificing themselves for the good of Cosmos. The prologue chapter does meander, and it's a bit of an Ouroboros in its reasons for existing, but the air of fatalism that carries throughout lends a philosophical weight that makes it worthwhile. It helps that Duodecim also overhauled the way story mode plays a bit. There are two phases to story mode: overworld exploration and dungeons. Dungeons were the entirety of the original story mode, so the ability to traverse a map and find things sells the scope and pacing of the story much more effectively. The map is speckled with treasure chests to find, wandering enemies to engage, and bonus dungeons to grind in. Does the overworld add much substantive gameplay? No, it doesn't, and it could be argued that it's mostly padding. But that padding gives the mode space, downtime between dungeons for the player to take in the vibe of Final Fantasy and tweak their character to their liking. Not everything needs to be meaningful mechanically to be a meaningful contribution to the game. The dungeons are the core gameplay of story mode. It's set up something like a board game, with spaces laid out on a grid and enemies and rewards placed throughout. The player starts in one space and must work their way to an icon at the end of the board that will let them exit the dungeon. You can't move through enemies, so if one's in the way of a treasure or an exit, you have to fight them. To prevent this whole setup from being more than window dressing for a series of battles, Dissidia implements the chain mechanic. In the overworld, you'll gain items that allow you to chain battles back to back, depending on the shape of the chain. The reason you'd want to do this is to earn KP, a story-exclusive currency used to buy rare items. Each dungeon has an extra objective to complete in battle besides winning, like finishing in a certain time frame, and doing so will earn KP. If you fight in a chain, you can multiply the amount of KP you earn for every consecutive battle you clear the condition in. It's ideal to find the spot on the board where the most pieces will intersect when using a chain item and fight as many opponents as possible. Just like an RPG dungeon though, your health doesn't recover between battles without the use of items, so taking on too many enemies can be dangerous. The resource management is minimal, and the chain mechanic isn't necessarily required to complete the game, but they add just enough to dungeons to make them a different experience than simply playing standard matches over and over. Unfortunately, the overworld and dungeons aren't enough to carry story mode on their own. Once the prologue chapter is complete, the story proper begins, and it just isn't interesting enough. The prologue chapter does its best to tell an emotional story with a rotating cast, and mostly succeeds. The base story uses the fighting game genre's classic storytelling structure. Each character gets a self-contained story that intersects with others every once in a while. This is the structure that serves fighting games well, letting them highlight each character's personality with minimal storytelling and maximal gameplay. Like with most things, Dissidia tries to fuse this with RPG elements, but this is one instance where the two truly don't mix well. Cutscenes are much more frequent and much longer, shifting the ratio of gameplay to story from 90 to 10 to 60 to 40, which would be fine as long as the story content is good. The character stories are the one aspect of Dissidia that is not ambitious. Each story is a simplified retelling of the character's inner conflict from their game, ending with them getting their crystal once they've overcome their issues. Terra tries to define herself as a person and not a tool. Cloud struggles to find a purpose. Squall has to learn to trust and care for others. Those are all compelling stories that were told in detail and at length in Final Fantasies 6, 7, and 8. It was such a missed opportunity to shoot for truncated retreads of the series instead of focusing on all these characters getting to interact and become allies, or how this original setting works. The structure also works against the strengths of Dissidia's gameplay. Hopping between characters every hour and a half, not really returning to them after completing the story, means that the satisfaction of RPG progression is limited. It's easy to imagine a version of Dissidia where the players got to form a party of their choice, leveling and customizing them throughout a story that takes advantage of Dissidia's franchise crossover status. The most tragic aspect of this is that kind of game is in Dissidia. Completing chapters in the story unlocks journal entries, a readable account of a story that seems disconnected from the rest of the game. As more of the journal is unlocked, though, it becomes clear that it's detailing events that led to the creation of Dissidia's world and the cycle of war, answers the main story only hints at. The journal tells a story of innocents being corrupted by genetic experiments, creating a weapon that can't be controlled and destroys the world. An original Final Fantasy story told only between the lines of an uninspired one. A secret chapter that directly addresses this part of the setting, one that's unlocked after beating the main story, and even lets the player make a party of whatever characters they want, is a small consolation. The fact that it requires level 90 characters to stand a chance mean that it comes far too late to make up for the rest of story mode. Story mode falling short doesn't make Dissidia a failure though, not even close. It was a first try at something new, making design choices that are equal parts ingenious and clunky. Missteps are to be expected when there isn't a blueprint of how to do something. Games are iterative, and Dissidia was supposed to be iterated on. The fact that it hasn't been in 15 years is a real shame, and it only makes Dissidia a more noteworthy game than when it first released. Dissidia Final Fantasy is a testament to the fact that assumptions on what can or can't work in games should always be questioned, because the results can truly be one of a kind. I hope you enjoyed the video. Believe it or not, Dissidia was the first Final Fantasy game I ever played, and I'm happy my positive memories of it remain mostly intact. Thanks for watching.